Welcome to Asbury's closing event to celebrate Black History Month 2020. The plan for our book discussion is that Bishop Stith and I will chat a bit about his father's book, and then we'll open the discussion for questions from you in the audience. And then we will sign books for those interested in purchasing them and helping support the Descendants of the Witty, a nonprofit dedicated to preserving the history of the settlement in Nebraska that his family helped found. And then there will also be refreshments available afterwards as well. So Bishop Stith, it is an honor to speak to you about your father's book, Sunrises and Sunsets for Freedom by Forrest C, and some of your memories of him and of your family's history. So let's start with some of the earliest history. William P. Walker was your great-grandfather.
Little louder, please.
William P. Walker
Much better.
was your great-grandfather and was born a slave. Based on your father's account and your knowledge of your family, tell us a bit about where he was born, his life of slavery, and how he escaped from it via the Underground Railroad.
Thanks for coming and sharing with me today. Appreciate it very much. William P. Walker, my great-grandfather, was born in Ohio in a farm in Chillicothe, Ohio. You may know where that is, down a little bit to the south. There's a farm there. He was born there, but his mother, named Marge, was an escaped slave from Virginia and Kentucky. It kind of went Kentucky, if you look at the map, goes to Virginia, then back up. And he began his life there. She was not married to her husband. He was a Quaker, and took them in their slavery condition. So he was born out of that relationship, which you know all about. We need to go to that story. But nevertheless, William P. Walker, a farmer, dedicated his life to taking care of those around him. He took care of escaped slaves, and especially William P. was taught to read and write and so forth, and learned a couple of trades like carpentry and some things on the sea. But after he was a teenager, he decided that he didn't want to do that because he wanted to be completely free. Now, parenthetically, you have to understand that Ohio was a free state. No person born in slavery was still free, because slave catchers could come across and get you, or all kinds of things would happen. So he didn't like that condition. So as a teenager, he left. And if you look at the map, and somewhere there's a point up there I can show you. It should be at the big red at the bottom, should be Ohio. Right there is where he journeyed up, all the way up to a place called North Buxton and South Buxton, Canada, where many escaped slaves had come. And the journey was treacherous, but it was a good journey. And he worked around different places and did things, and eventually became very active in the Buxton community. Some of you who went with us on the Underground Railroad remember that. He was a member of the Richardson Methodist Episcopal Church, and there was my start with Methodism. And he was a postmaster general. But after a while, he got a little weary. Am I going too fast for you? After a while, he got antsy because he really liked the farm area. And there wasn't enough farm country in Buxton. So you heard about land being available in Nebraska. Now get your time dates on it. He was born in 1858, before the Civil War ended. But as soon as the Civil War ended, or thereabouts, he and a group of settlers got on wagon trains and moved all the way west, all the way, followed the Oregon Trail, and went to the end of Nebraska in the Sandhills. And that's where he made his life, William P. Walker. And my father was born in that area too, but that's another story. We'll go into that. So that was the background. How this came about. William P. Walker, ex-slave, but a pioneer and one of the first pioneers. In fact, the records will show he bought the first land of any black in Nebraska. And the settlement called DeWitt now was the first official settlement of any people of color in the state of Nebraska. Okay? So this book is a story of that, which my dad wrote. I'm getting ahead of it, but let's get the basics. This is the book. My dad wrote this several years ago, several decades ago before he died. And I had it on the shelf and had told him I would rewrite, rework it, and edit it and so forth. But you know how things do, they went on and on and on. And I would have done it, but I would probably never done it, but my extended family, who I didn't know, out in Omaha, got into the story again and found and made a monument out in western Nebraska near Overton, where they left, where the Whitty family was, and are celebrating it across the state. And I said, well, it's time that you have the rest of the story. So I went back and had it reprinted, which is no small thing. And I thought it was easy, and no inexpensive thing.
That's right.
Both were difficult. But did that, and then I added some things that he was too humble to say. So if you read the book, read the end of it too, and then you'll get what used to say the rest of the story. Okay,
So he just gave you a great summary of the book itself, and I'm going to go back a little bit to ask him to expand on some aspects of it.
okay.
So one of the things that the book that I thought was particularly striking is the real descriptions of what escapes meant, what it entailed to be an escaped slave. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, from the time of day to what escaped slaves had to fend off and how they found their way.
We don't have the specific details of William P. Walker, but we know what ex-slaves had to go through. First of all, you had to, Harriet Tubman. Have you seen the story, Harriet?
Yes.
Well, I don't need to tell you much then, because that's the basic story of everyone who followed the Underground Railroad. And one of the key conductors of that, of course, was the Quakers. And that's who William P. Walker's good fortune was, a Quaker named Walker, who helped him and escape. All kinds of ways they used to run. But you had to be careful, because the slave catchers were paid a heavy price to get an escaped slave. But nevertheless, they usually went at night. They followed the North Star, and they found ways and means to surreptitiously do wagons with holes in the wagons and all kinds of things. And which one of those William P. followed, we don't know. But we also think, I suspect, as I look it over, he went up some of the rivers, like the Ohio River, all the way up towards Canada, because he had a background in working in the waterways. We know that. So that's probably what I suspect he did. And he hid along that way and worked himself out. And then finally, when he got to Detroit, he didn't come back. And he stayed in the waterways there and worked for a while. And that's basically it. There's some exciting stories which have been told. My dad tells a story from one of his aunts of one of the relatives and their travel. And that's exciting. You want to read that. But that's about
it. William P. Walker's arrival in the settlement in Ontario, in Buxton, was precipitated in part, correct me if I'm wrong, by the Fugitive Slave Act. And I wonder if you could just explain that a little bit more about what that was and how Buxton became such a key destination.
Yeah, what I was referring to was there were a couple of acts by Congress and the Supreme Court that messed up the ability for the Underground Railroad to function well and for people of color to find freedom. The Fugitive Slave Act is one of those, which prescribed, related to this Mason-Dixon line, which was a part of the Missouri Compromise. You know that story. And if you were in the north of that, you were supposed to be free. But if you got over there and your slave catchers from your home area came to get you, before the Fugitive Slave Act, you were okay. And once that was passed, the slave catchers were given the freedom to cross all the way up to Canada, if they could make it that far. and bring you back home. So across Canada, of course, had freed their slaves, and there was no more, so it was fairly safe. So a lot of people drove up, and walked up, and sailed up all the way over to where we were, Ruth, on the Underground Railroad trip. And the Fugitive Slave Act could not function then because you were out of this country. You were in another country, Canada. And that was crucial.
Your father received a letter from a relative who spoke of his grandfather serving as a postmaster in Buxton. So do you know any more about that part of his life, what he did in Buxton, and how unusual his roles were there?
My great-grandfather settled in the Buxton area and eventually married one of the people who lived there, one of the families, Kersey family. Sarah Kersey is her name. And she was a little bit more, I use the word genteel, he was. Another word I'm looking for, what it would be. But he also was trained, so with everybody, he was able to work in a different amount of areas. He farmed for a while, he worked on the waterways, but then he was named for 3 years, he was named 1877 to 1880 precisely. He was named the first Postmaster General of the new community of Buxton. Now I have to tell you a little bit about Buxton because that was crucial. It was made and developed by ex-slaves entirely. And if you'd see it, you wouldn't believe it. It's a beautiful community still there. Parcels of land were set up, and it was very little land for growing things. But people worked together, they cooperated, they built their community, they built schools, and it's said in history books that the school system was so good in Buxton that the white people outside the area would bring their children to Buxton to get educated. It was that good. And so it was a special community, and it's still present. Now, it doesn't have the oomph that it had back in 1880, but it's still there. And if you get a chance to go up to the Chatham area of Canada, look it up. It's beautiful.
One more thing about his role in Buxton was that he was a Sunday school superintendent, we've learned. And can you just talk a little bit about his religious life in that community before he went to Nebraska?
Frankly, I know very little about what you just said. we do know that he was a member of the Richardson M.E. Church, which I suspect was the British Methodist Episcopal Church. And he was very active, Sunday school teacher and so forth, but we don't have any of the details. One of my dilemmas is, in the book, and when it goes so far, I need to be honest about that, is if he had a diary, my father was not able to find a diary. So he had to become a detective. I call my dad first a writer, but secondly a detective. He had to surmise from this to conclude that, and from that you could conclude that, from that you conclude that. So we know his religious background. We know that when they developed the DeWitt settlement in Nebraska, one of the first things the group did was to find a pastor who happened to be an AME pastor. So they started a church in the DeWitt settlement community, and it's still present.
After your great-grandfather married and had children, he learned, as the book says, of, quote, cheap but good land along the Union Pacific Railroad in Johnson County, Nebraska, USA. So could you tell us a little bit more about why that was appealing to him and how he got there and became the first black settlement in Nebraska?
My great-grandfather obviously had learned farming in Chillicothe, Ohio, and so he was in love with farming. But the Buxton community, as beautiful as it was, and as pristine as it was, and as affluent as it was in many ways, had very little land for farming. So he and others who had fled different places yearned for a chance to farm and have their own land. There was nothing there, so they heard of the area in Nebraska. Well, there were several acts, Kincaid Act and some others, that made it possible to get land either cheap or free. So they headed out. The record shows that in 1860, before he even thought about leaving, he had bought some land in Nebraska. What happened to that, we don't know. But I don't think that was all the way to the west. But the wagon train, Conestoga wagons, covered wagons like you saw in the movies, all that, they got it. It took them almost a year to get from Canada to the western part of Nebraska. And you can see why. The average time of the wagon train was about 4 weeks from the one end of Nebraska to the other. So you take the other states, you had to cross and down and up and rivers and so forth. You can see it was almost a year's travel. But he was attracted by the land, and they developed the land. One of the problems with the land was it was limited because it was sandhill country. I'd like to say that my great-grandfather got somewhat conned because it sounded good, but most of the land that was developed around there was for cattle ranchers. In fact, my grandfather, not my great-grandfather, my grandfather moved from Lincoln out there to be back with his family with a promise of land, and he discovered there was nothing but sand hills. And all you could do was raise cattle. So he had put his money up, but he didn't do anything. So he had to quit farming and become a cook for a box cattle ranch. And that's what he did, and that's how my dad grew up. Part of his life was up in that part of the area.
So I'm gonna skip ahead to make sure first that we understand how you got to be here. So tell me if I'm right about this, that your great-grandfather's first wife died and he remarried, and eventually his oldest daughter Maggie married Christopher Stith in Nebraska, and among their children was your father. Okay.
My father had to have 2 wives because he had so many children. He exhausted the first one, Sarah Kersey, after 7 children. I said my great-grandfather. I said, who knows what I said? My great-grandfather, William P. Walker, exhausted the first wife, Sarah Kersey, and they moved to the western part of Nebraska. Certainly after that, after 7 children every other year, and the farming and all the Conestoga wagon and so forth, she died. Meanwhile, the way they did it there, you'd have to go far. It was an extended family affair. There were 4 major families. It was the Walker family, the Hatter family, the Riley family, and the Kersey family. Okay? So what happened is the Hatters had a daughter whose name was Charlotte. She married a Riley, of course. So the family were still together. And then when he died, the same time that my great-grandfather's wife died, they just naturally were married. That's the way it was. And that's the way they extended, that's the times it was. You didn't stay single. You just found somebody else who was unmarried. So she had 5 more children.
Good Lord.
If I was about 12 children altogether. Meanwhile, my father's mother was named Margaret, and she was in the first group of families that went to Westerns, and she met and married a man from Kansas named Christopher Columbus Stith, which is consistent with the time. Yeah, and they moved to Lincoln, and things didn't go well for him as much as he thought. He had planned to be a doctor, but the money ran out, so he did odd jobs, and then went back to the old farmland settlement out in western Nebraska. And I just told you about that. That didn't work well either. Then he came back to Lincoln, and that's where my father when Well, the rest of his story is another story too. But he tells all that in the book, so I want to entice you to read some of the book, so I have to tell you everything. You only have to read some by book.
All right, so we're going to skip ahead now to memories that you have of your early life with your father when he was a minister, and then when he made the difficult decision to be a chaplain in the U.S. Army.
My father was called to the ministry at an age of about 21, 22 years old. And in Lincoln was a small town and very few opportunities to do a whole lot of things. In fact, it still is, when there's the truth about it. But he was called to ministry, and he became the preaching boy wonder of Lincoln. So all the churches claimed him, and each one was going to help him. He went to Bishop College in Dallas, Texas first on a scholarship. Then he met my mother there, and he was so enticed by her that I came along too. And so he had to come back to Nebraska, and then another church grabbed him and said, well, that's all right, there's a school down in Kansas City. So he went there, and he pastored for a while there. And that's where in his early years, for the first 8 years of my life, was a son of a traveling preacher. In those days, the Methodist Church moved you every 2 years.
Right.
You had no choice. Every 2 years. It was like a football thing. 1, 2, 3, hot. And we went over to Kansas. But then when I was at 8 years old, he made the decision with my mother that it was in the middle of World War II, that the young boys there needed support. And he saw a thing in the post office that they were eager for chaplains. So he applied, and he had the credentials, and the schooling was accepted. So the next 4 years, or the next 6 years actually, he was a chaplain of the United States Army. He served overseas in the Pacific Islands through 3 battles, but mostly service-oriented, building bridges and so forth with the troops. And meanwhile, we were left in Kansas, which is the last place we were, and I grew up without a father, basically, for 4 years of my life. And that was difficult. And then when he came back, he brought us to the East Coast. His first assignment was in Virginia. The next assignment was in Fort Meade. And that's where, for 2 years, I went to Bates High School in Annapolis. And some of my friends who went there in this church were with me. And then he decided to wrap it up. And after 6 years, they talked about sending to Korea. He said he wouldn't leave his family again. So if he couldn't take them with him, he would ask for a discharge. They gave him an honorable discharge. He went back to Nebraska, and we settled there. And then he tried to do some things there while his goal was to go back and get a couple of advanced degrees to serve him with a pastor. That didn't happen for a couple of reasons. That's in the book too. It's in the back section. I wrote an extra, and you'll find it in that. But he did well. He pastored. He was a great pastor, a good preacher. Better than this one. Of course, my mother was too. But they were a great couple. Did great things for the Lord, and I'm grateful for that. And so I grew up my last years, high school, back to Lincoln, high school in Lincoln, then the University of Nebraska, then the Drew Seminary, da-da-da-da. And I finally got here, go a roundabout way. Well, let me tell you that story. When I was in my last year of school at True Theological Seminary in New Jersey, the Baltimore and Washington conferences were black conference and white conference. You know about that. That's central jurisdiction.
Yeah, right.
So when the church died in the city of Washington, the habit had been to either sell it or some kind of way get rid of the building. The Douglas Church, 11th and H Northeast, had a reverter clause, which if you sold the church or got rid of it, all the proceeds went to the heirs of Flora P. Douglass. But they didn't want to do that. So the bishop talked to the president of the Drew Seminary. Don't you have a young man, and one of the women then, young man who could do this? And he said, yeah, Forrest Stith. So they came up and visited me, and I came down and visited them. And Bishop Oxton was the bishop then. And he said, would you do this? So I had nothing else to do. I was single, so I was just graduating. So I came on down, and that's how I got down here and started Douglass. So I was for 6-7 years the only black in the Baltimore Conference, which was okay in terms of discrimination. The big thing was you couldn't take a bathroom break without somebody saying, what happened to Forrest? So conspicuous. But it was great. So we've been here and, from the Baltimore Conference for 26 years, and then elected to the episcopacy in 1984, and Josephine and I went on our way. One little bit of that story was that at Drew, while I was at Drew, I became very close friends to a young man named Henry Gregory III. And some of you might know Henry. Henry eventually became pastor of Shiloh Baptist Church. But he and my wife-to-be were friends at Howard University, and very close friends. So when I came down, he heard I was coming down here. He called up and gave her my name and my name to her. And we met. She was a Baptist then, Metropolitan. And we met, and that's been it since. It was only 60 years ago in June.
I have 2 more questions, and then we're going to open it up to you all to ask questions. So be ready for your questions, please. Did you and your father ever serve in ministry together? And if so, how and when?
He did an interim pastorate in Lincoln in our church in Newman in between. And while he was there and doing that, I was in college, and I was the assistant pastor, which meant I did everything he wanted me to do with no pay.
And my last question before you all get to ask questions is, can you tell us the meaning behind the title of the book, Sunrises and Sunsets for Freedom, and how you see it relating to your family's history and where we are today in society?
My dad was very creative, but he was also very biblical. The two merged together, and somewhere in the Psalms, and I can't point to it right now, refers to sunrises and sunsets. And my dad latched onto that as he was working on the story of my great-grandfather, and that became the title of the book. Excuse me. It's hard to ask questions if you haven't read the book, isn't it? Yeah. So maybe what we need to do is give you a chance to purchase books. Now, I have a dilemma I need to tell you. Part of it is in doing the book. My purpose in doing the book was not for personal gain, but to further the work of the DeWitty Foundation, which is the descendants of DeWitty. So the book, I made bought the first set of books, and made the proceeds go to the foundation. And the foundation bought the second group of books, which I had edited some more, and they sent me about 30 copies. That's a dilemma. But it gets complicated because you have to buy so many books to make it worthwhile. That's why they do it. So I didn't want to put any money out that didn't have to. So I have 30 books available today. And there's more than that for people here. So what we'll do is, it only takes 2 weeks to turn around. So you'll each can purchase until Brenda Bland, wherever she is, hold your hand up, Brenda, wherever. Till Brenda Bland runs out, and then she'll take your name and $20 instead of $15, because I got to send them to you. And then in 2 weeks you'll get them. Is that fair enough? Is that clear enough? But we'll go to verse 29. And what I will do is, my dad, what I did too, was when I reprinted them, I reprinted a book that had his signature on it. So his signature is on the first book, is on the book that I'm selling today. And I will sign it too, and anything else you want. I'm here for the link. Does that make sense? Is that fair? Okay, all right, that's it. Now, what else? Anything else before we go into books? Yes.
Were there Native Americans in that area where you settled, and what was the relationship?
According to my father, the Native Americans, whites, and blacks lived in the western part of Nebraska in harmony together, and there were no conflicts. That's his story. Okay, but they were there, most definitely.
You called your father, who passed away in 1986 at the age of 76, the guiding light for my entire ministry as a pastor, church executive, and bishop in the United Methodist Church. So before I let you stop talking, would you just tell us one of the greatest lessons you learned from him?
Greatest lessons I can't repeat. Because I try to be, but he was so humble, so gracious, and so strong simultaneously. And that was the greatest lesson he gave to me. And I think what I learned most in my life, in living with him, was I was called not to preach as much as I love it, but I was called to be a pastor, because that's what I saw in him that moved me the most. When I would follow him to a funeral, or to a person who was ill, or a person on the street that needed help, I saw a pastoral image which I wanted to follow. And I've done my best since.
Can we all thank Bishop Stith for sharing some of his story with us?